Welcome, everyone, to our webinar on liability, the law, and critical control management. My name is Sean Brady. I'm a forensic engineer, and I'm the MD here at Brady Heywood. Joining me today is a couple of people who you probably know quite well. One of them is Jodi Goodall. She's the head of organizational reliability at Brady Heywood. She's got over 20 years background in operational expertise in mining, in heavy manufacturing, explosives, and logistics. And we're also delighted to say that we're joined by Greg Smith, partner at Jackson McDonald in Perth. He specializes in workplace relations and safety, and he's also the author of Paper Safe and Proving Safety. And if you haven't read those, you should absolutely get out and give them a go. Why are we here and why are we talking about the law and critical control management? Well, the idea for this webinar really came out of a lot of the work that Jodi has been leading. We spend a lot of time talking to companies who are doing fatal risk programs, or they're trying to embed critical control management in their organizations. And it's a departure from how many people have sort of approached the management of health and safety before. And of course, once you introduce change in a workplace, especially around health and safety, that starts to make people nervous. It starts to make in-house lawyers nervous in companies to start asking, well, what does this change mean? Are we at increased liability? How is this different from how we used to do it before? And these are very, real concerns for people to work through. Also talk to a lot of senior leaders who are trying to work through those questions as well. So this webinar really is about trying to trash out some of these issues. So it's really a chat between us and Greg about what is critical control management like? How is it different from a legal perspective to what we've seen before? And it's about having a real conversation about where critical control management doesn't butt heads with the law, where it's actually very consistent, but it's also going to try and acknowledge where it does butt heads and how we should try and think about those sorts of issues. So the approach we're taking, you'll be delighted to know there's no PowerPoint slides. Jodi's going to start and she's going to give us a brief introduction to critical controls. And that's really to get us all on the same page and get a common language among us in terms of what we need. Then we'll have a chat to Greg, and we're going to confine this chat first to the state of the industry or various industries right now. What are industries doing? How do we believe this is working from a practical perspective in terms of keeping people safe? And how does the law view this? Then, when we've got that out of the way, we're going to get into critical controls. We're going to talk through some of the issues that we see, the concerns that we hear when we're out talking to people, and hopefully Greg will be able to give us all the answers in terms of what we need to do to manage these risks. Just very quickly, in terms of approach to the webinar, you'll see there's a Q&A button. We would love your questions, but we're not going to actually answer them in this webinar. Now, that's the bad news. The good news is we would love to come back in the new year and do a special webinar where we just look at the questions you've asked us. We've got a view of what we think the questions are that should be asked around this subject, but we want to hear from you as well. So please put your questions in the Q&A as they occur to you as we move through the webinar. Upvote the ones you're interested in, and we will get back to you in the new year to tackle some of those. Like any webinar that talks about legal stuff, we do have to put a disclaimer on this to say that it's obviously only for reference purposes only. It doesn't constitute legal advice, and you shouldn't rely on it as such. It's really important that you go out and get your own legal advice for your own specific circumstances. So, with all that out of the way, I'm going to hand over to Jodi to talk about critical controls and introduce us to what they are and what's important about them. Jodi.
Thanks, Sean. Hi, Greg. And I just want to say before I start, Sean said we're going to trash out this, but that's his Irish accent. He actually means thrash out. We have this problem a lot, third and turd, where it's quite comes up quite a bit. So I always have to interpret for you from the Aussies. So I think we want to start by really just talking about what's the philosophy behind how do we prevent fatalities. And why is critical control management so important, and why would we spend so much time doing this as the primary way of preventing fatalities? So, I think what we've learned from the Brady review and a lot of the other fatality reviews in mining and in lots of other industries is we aren't actually killing workers in new ways. When you look over, the last 50 years, it's the same types of fatalities happening over and over again. And the really important thing about that is that means that we actually mostly know the controls that we need to put in place, and we know the systems of work that need to be in place. And if we that's really helpful, because if we can build controls that are reliable and make sure that they're in place and effective in all of the work situations, that's our best chance at preventing workers dying. So that's kind of the philosophy behind critical control management. And probably the reason why in Queensland mining, we're starting to move to putting that into the legislation now. That'll happen over the next year. But why we have principal hazard management plans, and the details in those are really focused on the fatality risks, the controls that prevent those risks eventuating, and making sure they're in place and effective. So the other thing to talk about is ICMM, the International Council of Mining and Minerals. The ICMM have brought out a good practice guide quite a few years ago, and mining, actually even in construction, we're seeing it now, in oil and gas, is the adoption of critical control management, which is the framework in that good practice guide, really helps companies to do this, to focus on the big risks, and that's done in the process by usually by bow tie risk management. So understanding what are your big risks, and then doing a bow tie risk assessment for each of those, and that helps you to flesh out for your particular organisation what the key causes are, how you prevent those causes eventuating, and how you mitigate the really bad outcomes when you do lose control of those situations. So that's what a bow tie does. And then the whole point of critical controls is picking out the controls that manage most of the risk, so the ones that significantly prevent or mitigate the bad outcomes, and then going a step deeper with those controls, defining their performance, so what it looks like when they're in place or they're not in place, when you need them in place, and what keeps them reliable. And that's called a performance criteria. And it's super important to be able to then objectively say whether the control is in place and effective or not. And so, you can set metrics around those things. You can use them to report underperforming controls and really set a standard in your company with your contractors. That's the whole point of critical control management. And then I suppose you can actually take that criteria and put, verify it in the field, and that's really, really helpful as well. And I'll just give you an example of what that might look like. So I'm talking theory here, but if I take that down to practice, and you think about a fall from height risk, that would be a whole bow tie would just be done on understanding the causes with fall from heights. And then you determine what are the key controls on either side of the bow tie, the preventative and the mitigative ones. And one of those that typically is a critical control would be the fall prevention system. And so, for example, that might be made up of the harness, the choice of fall protection, and the anchor point as a system, and the implementation of that system. And then you take that critical control, which is what that would be, a step further, and you determine what its performance needs to look like. So it might be things like you only purchase equipment that is designed to Australian standards. You have a system to verify that it's effective, and that might be a color coding system, tagging. A lot of companies use that. Then you have workers that are trained and competent to be able to inspect that gear and use it appropriately. And then you might have another criteria, which is around choosing higher systems of work, like EWPs over fall prevention over fall arrest, if you can. So that's the performance criteria, and it's really important to do those things objectively. And that's one of the things we find in systems doesn't happen. So we write these really ambiguous criterias around things. And that leads people to go and check stuff in the field and use their judgment rather than the factual knowledge. And so you end up with programs falling over with all green. Every single check is all green. That can be a big problem. The other things we find issues with those programs are they're missing key controls. So if you think about the Coal Mine Board of Inquiry, that was sparked by the Anglo Grosvenor mine gas ignition underground, and they had missed a key critical control, which was the ventilation system in their mine. And so because they weren't highlighting that as a check that needed to be done, it actually, the whole rest of the system fell over. Critical controls weren't reported as failing when they were having a lot of gas exceedances. And so it didn't get elevated. And that's the whole point. If you've got a good critical control program, you're starting to elevate the controls that are super important in your business. And then from that, you're in a position that you can, I suppose, spend more time and prioritize those things over, the more bureaucratic stuff we see in safety. So design is a key issue if we think about some of the big issues. Also, when you've got using those programs, we often find that people start to use them as audits rather than learning about where their controls are weak and failing. And so if you can turn the system from compliance into learning, if you're really choosing to understand and be fascinated by failure. And we also see that people see them as standalone programs and they're not linked into the rest of their safety management system. So, if you've got critical controls, that's how you should be talking about your incidents. That's how you should be thinking about what you prioritize in terms of your audits. And then the last big issue that we see with critical control programs in specific is really leaders not responding to underperforming controls. So, and this is where it gets good, but it's also where it gets really uncomfortable. No one wants to know that their baby is ugly or their system doesn't work or any of that stuff. And I suppose actually recognizing that it's pretty normal for controls to be failing, and seeing that as something that is really important to be working on is I suppose where we see these systems getting really good. That's a little overview. Sean, have I missed anything? Do you want me to expand on anything, or I've got a question for Greg?
No, I think this the point that is really important. The audit tool versus the learning tool, and for us, critical control management should be treated as a learning tool, not an audit tool. But boy, is it likely to descend to an audit tool pretty quickly.
Yeah, it sure does. We love that. We love to pull out a checklist and forget that it's all about learning about controls, whether they're weak or ineffective. I agree. So I've just spoke really specific about critical control programs and preventing fatalities. But Greg, my first question for you is about what's happening in industry now, because what I see in industry is that most of the stuff that we're doing is a far cry from actually preventing fatalities, and a lot of the stuff we're doing in safety is just not linked to fatality prevention or serious accident prevention. And I'm wondering, from your perspective, I mean, both of your books allude to this, but from your perspective, in terms of where organisations are spending their time and resources, what do you see?
Thanks, Jodi. And g'day, everyone. If I was to characterise it generally, I think the focus of most people when it comes to safety is still on minor injury prevention. I think we are still deluded by the notion of injury rates and the idea that if we can keep those down, then now somehow that magically transforms into some broader safety thing. I don't know what sits behind that. And I do think the pervasive thinking around the sort of perverted version of Heinrich's triangle, Bird's triangle, the idea that if we can control the minor stuff, we can control the major stuff. I think that's been well and truly debunked through academic research. It's certainly been debunked through major accident event inquiries, but it's a narrative that I think still dominates, particularly executive level thinking for some reason. And again, I think the pervasive driver of injury rate data is hugely problematic in all of these areas. Now, I think it's easy to be critical of that when you're coming at it from a fatal risk control program. I get that. I do understand some of the fundamental drivers behind it, because the thing that confronts organisations on a day-by-day basis is probably engagement with their workers' compensation insurer. That is probably a regular engagement that organisations have in relation to safety. They don't have that same sort of regular engagement with the health and safety regulators. They don't have that regular sort of engagement with critical events in their organisation. So the dominant management concern in many organisations is workers' compensation, and I think that has a role to play in driving some of the responses to safety. It seems to be that way.
I agree. I think so I mean, you think about how often a site would have a serious accident or a fatality, and it can be easy to think that if those things aren't happening, that you're well managing that stuff, and you probably don't need a program around that. And I reckon the other thing is there's still that view, or maybe the thinking's not behind it with senior leaders, in terms of if you look at your workers' comp data and you look at your LTIs and TRIF, they're made up of things like slips and trips and minor injuries that are never going to be any worse. And I think the stats are around 80%. So 80% of the stuff that is in the workers' comp claims are never going to be any be a serious accident or a fatality. And things like musculoskeletal strains and sprains, that stuff is not how you look at the Safe Work Australia data. That is not how people are dying. People are dying from vehicle accidents, rollovers, being crushed by their own vehicles, or strata failures, or fall from heights. I think that is the top three, is falling and vehicle accidents. And so it just doesn't compute, does it? It seems madness.
Well, it kind of does at one level. I sit back, and my engagement with health and safety is serious accidents and fatalities, and your engagement is with serious accidents and fatalities. So if you're looking at safety from a serious accident and fatality perspective, it's easy to say everyone's got this wrong. If your normal daily engagement with safety is around minor injuries, either because you're working for a major mining company and that's what they're interested in, or that's the arguments you have with your insurance company every year at renewal time, then it does kind of make sense that we gravitate towards the management of those things. And I guess that's part of the problem, is that most organisations have got a limited bandwidth, and we tend to do a lot reasonably mediocrely instead of I don't even know if that's a word. It's pretty average, some of the stuff we do. So we do lots of stuff at a surface level. We create lots of artifacts of safety. We're seen to be doing a lot around safety. When you scratch the surface of it, as you would both be aware that that's what major inquiries do. You get beneath the surface, you see how fundamentally problematic the safety management systems are. And I think just so much is expected of organisations from a safety management perspective that most organisations don't have the resources to deal with it all. Those that do, I think, misapply the resources. And it seems like a week doesn't go by where somebody, at the moment at least, is suggesting some sort of change to regulation. So it is so difficult for organisations to get across this and prioritise things. And as you say, we're not killing people that are, people are disappointed at fatality rates, and I get that. But it's not a spectacular disaster out there in any sense. I think it's reasonably easy to drift away from that focus.
Yeah, and I mean, if you add the serious accident rate to the fatality rate, though, and I mean, serious accident rate, we're talking about, where people have got an amputation, or they've broken a really serious, a big bone, not fingers and stuff, or they've received burns to a heap of their body, or they've got life-changing illness, something like that. Man, that stat goes up. It is, it's way more intense. Yeah.
And by and large, and I'd be guided by you, but by and large, what we need to do to manage major accidents is no different from what we need to do to manage fatalities.
Absolutely. Yeah.
In broad terms, I think that's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's, I guess, that to answer your question in a long roundabout way, Jodi, that's kind of what I see out there.
And so you touched on bureaucracy and doing lots of stuff, I suppose. Do you want to just expand on that? Because I mean, your whole first book is about that, and it's actually how I first became fascinated in the stuff that you're doing. But do you just want to talk about how much bureaucracy you see, and especially when you're putting together defences for cases when there has been a fatality, and what works and doesn't?
It is unfortunately my experience of it is the majority of safety management is the generation of process. That's what I see, and then off the back of the generation of process, we have the measurement of activity, and we don't seem to have invested much time organisationally in assurance processes, and I mean real assurance process. So most of what we call, let me say first of all, most of what we call assurance, and I would suggest that a lot of critical risk programs fall into this camp as well, is simply the measure of activity. So I'll give you a sense. I was looking at a critical risk program for a client a while ago, and they had a dropped and falling objects was one of their concerns. And the business rules that drove the metric, so whether it was green, amber, or red, there was two business rules. One was whether the correct number of checks had been done, and the other was that there were no high or extreme outstanding corrective actions. Okay? So those are just measures of activity. They tell us nothing about quality, efficacy, whether the actual critical control is being managed. So that's what when I see in terms of bureaucracy, I see generation of standards and procedures and safe working procedures and SOPs and safe work method statements and JHAs and take fives and toolbox talks and pre-start meetings and checklists and all of this stuff, and then somebody having to run around and count all of that stuff to make sure that the right number has been done. That's my experience of when I talk about bureaucracy and mechanistic systems.
And you think about, I mean, site managers, for example, they've got statutory obligations. All of that stuff is how we do safety. And I mean, there's a fair bit of comfort in the fact that if my people are doing take fives, if we're writing JHAs, and I've got all of those artifacts, in place, and we're doing that same number of audits, there seems to be a fair bit of comfort in the fact that is going to protect in court when things do go wrong. Thoughts on that?
I guess two observations on that. One, it doesn't. Probably three observations. One, it doesn't. More often than not, what we're doing is we're producing databases of non-compliance because we keep all this stuff. No one really analyses it. It sits in archive boxes somewhere. Someone dies on site. We pull it all out. We analyse 2 years' worth of JHAs or take fives, and they're all rubbish. And so that's hugely problematic.
Just explain why that's problematic, Greg, because I think that's really important.
Well,
as a concept for people to get their head around.
Yeah. So if you take something like a JHA, and the organisation says, and I ask this question when I do lots of workshops with people, how many high-risk activities can I do on this site with a JHA? Okay. And the answer to that question is typically none. If you're doing a high-risk activity, you have a JHA. To me, that's dangerously close to the textbook definition of a crucial system. If I can't do a high-hazard activity without it, it's probably a crucial system. You go to the Pike River Royal Commission and it talks about the board didn't receive any information proving the effectiveness of crucial systems. So how do we prove the effectiveness of JHAs? Right? So if you stand there as an organisation, say, one of our key processes for managing critical risk on this project business site is the JHA, there's a fatality. The content of the JHA is, there's a range of things we see. One is it misses the actual hazard that led to the fatality. But the other thing is more problematic. So somebody's been killed, you've got a work group of 6. Those 5 were other workers who have signed on to the JHA. They'll be interviewed by the regulator and they'll be taken line by line through the JHA. How did you do this risk assessment? What does this mean? What does this word say? Because I can't read the writing. How does this control measure mitigate? Line by line by line. And what you end up with is you get admissions like, oh, look, we didn't really read it. John wrote that up in the crib room while we were getting the gear. I don't understand what that means. I was late, so I just signed on. We didn't really go through. All of this stuff comes up. Then all of a sudden, as an organisation, you're left with a range of particulars in a charge saying you didn't do everything reasonably practicable to manage the risk because you didn't provide training and competence because the people didn't understand the process, or you didn't provide adequate supervision because the document was not fit for purpose, or you didn't have proper systems. And then you go back and you look through, and so if you're trying to defend that position, what you're trying to demonstrate is that failure on that occasion was a one-off departure from your otherwise effective system. Okay, because that you can work with that from a defendable position. But when we go back to try and establish was there a systemic failure in the quality of our JHAs, or were our JHAs normally good and effective and this was a one-off departure, you go back and you look through the archives and you have a history of poor JHAs that look exactly like the one from the fatality. So all of a sudden it's very hard to build an argument that you had an effective system. And when you go and look at health and safety reporting, you don't get any sort of qualitative reporting through the organisation on a regular basis that says JHAs are one of our critical systems. We've gone and done this deep dive analysis and this is how we think they're working. The highest you normally get is if it exists at all, is a traffic light system that says the correct number of JHAs have been done or have been checked. Mm-hmm. Now, if you go, and just to extrapolate that a little bit further, if you go and read the Gibson decision, so this is the recent New Zealand decision, the prosecution of the Chief Executive Officer from the Port of Auckland for due diligence, failure to exercise due diligence. He was convicted single person fatality on night shift. And there's a paragraph and a half in there on management observations. And so again, lots of organisations would say management observations are an important part of our safety management system. And the court in the case made the observation that the only information about management observations was that the executive could see from the database was the number that were done. Didn't say where they were done, when they were done, what topics were discussed, and importantly, and this is the language of the court, they said importantly, there was no qualitative information about the content or the finding of the conversation. Hmm. So the problem we have, and this is really what I tried to talk about improving safety, is that we do a lot of stuff in safety. That's fine. I think everything we do in safety is subject to assumption and organisational corruption. All right. So when someone's doing a JHA, as an organisation, we're making a whole lot of assumptions about their competence to do that, their literacy skills, just a whole range of assumptions underpin that. We know that organisational corruption often defeats process, not just safety process. So these things become tick and flick exercises or just bureaucratic exercise. But then we don't measure the efficacy of the process, we count the activity. And everything we do in safety, I think, is subject to that kind of chain. And it's not new. So even you go back historically and you look at the Piper Alpha inquiry, so that was a failure of permit to work system. Most organisations would look at permits to work as a critical control. The inquiry made an observation that managers were aware that safety personnel on the Piper had to monitor the quality of the permit system. and this is the bit I think that managers need to pay attention to. The inquiry said, but nobody checked the quality of that monitoring. So we have processes, we say we get assurance that our process works because they're monitored, and no one goes and says, is the monitoring of those processes effective? And that's just another way of saying we actually don't understand the quality and efficacy of our process.
Yeah, we know it's there, but we don't know how effective it is.
Well, yeah, I mean, sometimes you will even question if it's there. So again, our major accident inquiries are often our best source of information. The BP Texas City disaster, where the checklist was done or meant to be done prior to startup. So there's a checklist of all the valves and gauges and measuring devices. It's being done by a worker. Supervisor comes along and says, we haven't got time for that. We're going to start up, ticks everything is right and signs it off. Now, is that the first time that ever happened on that site? I doubt it. We've got a lot of people here listening to this today. Could that sort of checklist shortcut be happening on their sites today? Yeah, absolutely. Of course it is. But what are the processes in our organisation that are important enough for us to really go and verify and understand efficacy and quality?
And being the devil's advocate, I mean, the example you just gave is actually, you need to measure activity, don't you, sometimes? Like, you need to know that the things you're putting in place or that you've got written in your management system are happening. Otherwise, you need to not write them in your management system and choose not to do them or formalise them.
But there's a again, this is the challenge. I think there's a qualitative discussion that goes on here, and there's a few things at play. One is we do so much stuff. I think we do need to be a bit discriminatory and say what's the stuff we're actually going to really pay attention to, and if there's stuff that we're going to pay attention to, what's the stuff we're going to take away. I think there's a real argument for taking stuff away. And one of the problems I see with new regulation, so if we suddenly now say, as is proposed in Queensland, we're going to embed critical controls into the mining sector, what are you going to stop doing to be able to resource and do that properly if you're not already doing it? Because I think if there's a lesson from the history of safety, it is that we just layer stuff on top of stuff rather than just exercise some real discrimination to take stuff away.
And that's going to be sorry, Sean, go.
No, just on that point, Greg, I mean, it's fascinating, I found from reading your book, that the mentality appears to be create more and more safety paperwork and lots of checklists and all that sort of stuff, like you've spoken about. Can you just summarize what the law actually looks at when something goes wrong? What does the law care about? Because it's fascinating how different that is from the traditional view of what we think we need to do if you're not on the legal side.
So there's a couple of things. When we say the law, you kind of have to discriminate a bit between what a coroner might look at, what a Royal Commission might look at, what a personal injuries case might look at, and what a safety prosecution might look at, because they are slightly different. But if we stick with safety prosecution, the first thing to understand is that a safety prosecution is not an inquiry. Nobody is trying to understand what happened, what went wrong, how do we improve. That's not a prosecution. The regulator does an investigation, they prepare a brief, some lawyers look at it, lawyers come up with charges, and there's particulars, and we go and argue about whether the things that the prosecutor says we ought to have done are reasonably practicable. So that's the first thing. If we're talking, so again, two parts. If we're talking about the regulations, a breach of regulation, the regulator, the courts are looking at whether the regulatory requirement was complied with. So if somebody's on a construction site and a worker falls off at height and dies, and there's a breach, a prosecution for not having a safe work method statement, then that's what we're arguing about. Was there a safe work method statement? Not talking about quality, not talking about anything like that, just was there a safe work method statement that met the requirements of the regs? But the broader question is the reasonably practicable question. And at its core, in my view, what we are looking at is whether the organisation had a proper system to manage the risk and whether they knew that system was, or the extent they knew that that system was implemented and effective. So if I take Jodi's earlier example of working at heights, does the organisation have a proper system for managing the risk of working at height? And was that system implemented and effective? Now, the way we've approached that historically is to have a working at height standard and a working height procedure and training and some checklists and permits to work and all of this sort of stuff. And as a general rule, I think what the court looks, or sorry, what the prosecution looks to prove, so therefore what the court is paying attention to, is whether there was a process to manage the risk of working at height, and was it consistent broadly with the regulations and the codes of practice? I think that's kind of the first piece of the puzzle. And most of the time, most systems do align reasonably well, in larger organisations at least. And there's another conversation here about the socioeconomics of safety, big organisations versus small business. But so broadly speaking, was there a process? If it wasn't complied with on the day, why wasn't it complied with? And from a defence position, what we're trying to establish is that this was a one-off departure from an otherwise effective system. That's really what we're trying to do. Now, I criticise bureaucratic systems fundamentally because they don't translate into practice. So if you're looking for the gold standard, what you would have is a written process that everybody understands, is always implemented, and you've got evidence that it's understood and implemented. Okay. The way we go about creating safety frameworks makes that almost impossible because there's just too much for people to understand. So everybody naturally has to shortcut and interpret the process to come up with something that works for them. And I do think it is overly layered, it is overly complicated, and it's just extraordinarily difficult for the people on the ground to comply with what you're asking for. Now, the answer to that is not to say, well, the people on the ground just make it up. As Jodi said at the start, we've got a pretty good idea of what kills and injures people in most workplaces, and we've got a reasonably good idea of what the controls are. So if we could, in some way, shape or form, strip our systems back to those sort of risks and controls and just constantly monitor and enforce the implementation of those, we'd be much better off. But if we're constantly walking around our organisations looking at tripping hazards, I don't even know what people look at sometimes with all the minor injury stuff.
Hand injuries, strains and sprains.
Yeah, I think that's what detracts from our ability to actually manage critical risk well. We are so distracted by everything else. And I think we do see this. I was looking at something the other day that talked about, it must have been take fives, and there was all this stuff in take fives that had nothing to do with the critical risk that was being done on the day. So I think, and I think a lot of what we ask people to do in the name of safety, they're like the rest of us. We follow the path of least resistance. And if I've got to fill out all this paperwork, it's much easier for me just to go, oh, yeah, here's all the trivial stuff that we always put in, rather than a considered, really meaningful discussion about critical risk. And I believe, in part, it's because we just ask people to do too much that is not important. And anybody who looks at safe work method statements, which are designed to manage a particular class of high-risk activity in the construction industry, and and sees things like, the first step in the process is drive to site. That's just insane, in my view. It just makes no sense.
I mean, you've just talked about minor injuries, all that stuff, and the amount of effort that goes into managing strains and sprains, hand injuries, slips and trips, which are kind of the top three, 80, 90% of all of your TRIF workers' comp. None of that stuff is, like, in your experience, I mean, because you would know better than us, but is that what people, like, if you're an officer and you're the board and personally liable and may come under the industrial manslaughter laws, is that the kind of stuff like we should be focusing on?
No, whenever I talk to particularly senior executives, I say, well, you probably should be taking quite a selfish view of this. Most senior executives' difficult conversations start with when people die. Now, I think that's probably shifted a little bit under some of the new penalty provisions of work health and safety. So I think those sort of serious, permanently disabling, traumatic injuries are probably in that bucket now. But, organisations don't get prosecuted for sprained ankles and sore backs, all right? Much less any individuals getting prosecuted for it. I mean, individual prosecutions historically in Australia occur when people die. That's, in a very practical sense, that's where your legal risk of prosecution sits. If you kill lots of people, then you're probably off to some sort of parliamentary inquiry or royal commission. But again, there is, and that's easy to say, and it's logical and it makes sense until you're constantly dealing with workers' compensation. Mm-hmm. It's an important part of the process. I understand everything that is important and relevant to workers' comp. I'm not dismissive of it in any way, shape or form, but I do think it distracts organisations from dealing with critical processes.
Yeah. And I think you also see that a lot of organizations try to use the same strategies as they use for managing the TRIF and they genuinely believe they're going to manage their major fatality, major risks and fatality risks. Well, with that, let's transition to just the last part, the practical implementation of critical controls and the law and the tension we see when we go and we have these conversations with people and the conversations we know that are happening out there. Jodi, over to you in terms of leading this off.
Yeah, probably the biggest thing I see, and the question I get asked a lot, is senior leaders who may be officers under the law. They get good programs and they're starting to get good information, and they realize their controls aren't as effective or aren't in place as consistently as they think. And the more information they get, the more red on their dashboards, the discomfort comes with that in terms of, holy hell, I feel like I'm creating an evidence base, Jodi, for that's going to be used against me in court. What would be your advice, and what do you actually see in that respect to people having critical control programs that are good and telling them that their controls are not effective?
It's a really problematic area, to be honest. So we know, if you go back, there's a couple of problems with, when we're talking about senior executive liability, there are several problems in Australia, I think. And the main one is that the vast majority of prosecutions of so-called company officers in Australia are small business owners with hands-on day-to-day control of the work. So the hazards are in front of them because they're holding the ladder or driving the forklift. Okay? So that's problematic. We don't really have a very good jurisprudence base for those types of cases. But if you look at something like the Ritchie decision, which is a New South Wales decision under the old New South Wales legislation, which is the prosecution of a chief executive officer far removed from day-to-day operations. It was one of the reasons why I think in that case he was convicted was that there were systemic failures in the facility where the fatality occurred, and the systems failed to bring those failures to his attention. And so I think certainly if there are ongoing systemic failures in high-risk activities that the board and the executive are not aware of, then I do think that creates a path for liability. I don't doubt that at all.
So not knowing is not a defence.
It's certainly not a well. The test is what you know or what you ought to know when we're talking about reasonableness, and the extent to which your systems do or do not bring things to your attention. Again, I think a very important distinction here is the notion between one-off departures and systemic failure. One-off departures are easier to defend, particularly for individuals. Systemic failure more problematic. So again, if you look at the Gibson decision, and this is probably where some of the nervousness you're talking about comes in, Jodi. So the Gibson decision, CEO has been prosecuted, incident occurred on night shift. It was known that there were problems on night shift, and the CEO had seen something. I can't remember exactly what it was, but I think he'd seen something very similar to the work or the way work was being performed that caused the fatality. And he said in his evidence was it scared the shit out of him or something. So he had personal knowledge of a risk and it wasn't properly addressed. So it is almost certainly the case that personal knowledge of specific hazards does put a greater onus on the individual to do something about it, to follow up and to make sure they're closed out. I think that's absolutely correct. At the other end, I think it is absolutely correct that if you have systemic failures in your organisation around critical risks that are not being brought to your attention, that is a failure that can be sheeted home not only to the organisation but to the officers of the organisation. And I think this problem has been pointed out. There's a recent New South Wales Industrial Relations Commission decision looking at a challenge to an improvement notice, and it made the observation that the safety legislation seems to create and this was the words of the court, a perverse outcome, excuse me, that an organisation that takes the time to find out and understand what's going on seems to be at greater risk than an organisation that does not. And the court described that as a perverse outcome. And I think that's right. And I think that is a genuine tension that organisations struggle with.
How do you counteract that then? I mean, you're in this position where as a statutory officer, you kind of need to find that information and you ought to know. But then once you find out, it's got to be to do with responding to those controls.
You have to respond, yeah.
Yeah.
And again, when you look at criticisms of officers over the years, one of the main criticisms is the failure to respond in a timely manner. And so, again, in the Gibson decision, one of the key criticisms of the court was the failure of the organisation, i.e. through the executive, obviously. They had all these things that they were going to do, and it was the failure to implement them in a timely fashion.
Yeah. So what about if you don't have and then what happens, how would it be viewed if you don't have the resources? Like you start to find all this stuff out, you realise, oh my God, I thought I had this control in place over this fleet of vehicles, for example. Now I don't, and that's going to cost me $1 million.
So again, you run into, first of all, you're having a conversation about whether the control is reasonably practicable, right? Now, remembering that industry leading is not reasonably practicable. Okay, so there's a balance to be found there. That's a bit of a higher standard. But I think, again, one of the tests in reasonably practicable is the availability, suitability, and one other ability, I can't remember what it is, of controls. So if you say, well, we discovered this, here's the plan, here's the resources we committed to it, this is why we couldn't do it earlier, here's the evidence that we were complying with the plan, here's the other controls we had in place in the interim to deal with it, I think that's the best you can do. Certainly looking at it and saying we can't afford to do that will not help you. certainly coming up with industry best-in-class aspirational plan that you don't then stick to won't help you. That will be hugely problematic. A realistic, reasonable plan implemented in accordance with the planning process with the best available interim controls, I think is what you'd be relying on.
Can I throw another? Sorry, go on, Jodi. I'll jump in after.
It's just really a comment. That'll be really interesting to see when you get new emerging controls like proximity detection on heavy vehicles, and other competitors are having that standard, and you don't have it. When critical controls are in the legislation, it'll be really interesting to see what's reasonably practicable for same-size businesses.
So that sort of stuff will transition over time. So once upon a time, light curtains on machinery were not a thing.
Yeah.
Then they started to become a thing, and now they're probably standard.
I'm just going to jump in with another scenario for you, Greg, but just to remind everyone, there's still time. We've got another 8 minutes or so. Put in your questions into the Q&A. We've got some coming in, but there's plenty of room for more. What happens, Greg, when, let's say you go and you put a critical control management plan in, and your performance criteria are, as Jodi said, subjective. So you start to get all this feedback that your controls are fine, but you go and you talk to the workers, they're not fine. You may even be failing to near misses in some cases. How do you reckon the law would approach that situation?
Well, that to me, Sean, that's like the classic way that systems fail. The controls are not effective, or the controls become modified over time. This is the classic assurance trap that I think we have. As I say, most of the time, the measure of success in safety is a measure of activity.
Mm-hmm.
And what we don't do, and again, what I've argued for, is we don't go and do proper deep dive analysis of our critical risk to understand the level of understanding, efficacy, implementation, and then provide that kind of detailed narrative reporting to the executive to say, this is what we've gone and looked at, this is what we did, this is what we've found out. And that's what the missing piece is to me. So if you have a system of critical control checks for, again, working at height, and the number that comes through to the metric that comes through to the board is a green traffic light. If I'm a safety literate executive, there's two things I'm doing. One is I'm asking, what are the business rules that make that traffic light green? I need to know that.
Yep.
And then that's one, probably three things. So one, the second thing is I would be seeking either competent internal or from time to time external verification to say, this is a critical risk the board is concerned about. This is what we are being told. Can you please go and do an independent analysis and tell us whether we can trust our reporting? Because it's the faith in the reporting that I need as an executive.
Yeah.
And I think then the third thing I would do, and I would try to inculcate into our board or executive discussions, is to say, what we should, every time we get information about health and safety in our organisation, whether it's an incident, a hazard, or something, or even if it's an external event, we should be asking the question, what does this tell us about the status of our critical risks or controls? Is there anything from this that we need to know that is relevant to critical risks and controls? So if we had an event and there was a lack of supervision, it might not be a critical issue, but it's come to the board's attention. We had this event, we've investigated lack of supervision. Right? Hello, supervision is one of the critical controls we have across most of our critical risks in most organisations. Is this failure of supervision a one-off departure in this case, or is there any indication that supervision might be a broader issue across the organisation? Chief Executive Officer, go find out, come back and let us know.
I think
that's the role. I think that's the role of a safety literate executive.
Yeah, and I can I add to that and tell me whether you think this is right or not? But it's not just about the information you are getting, but also the information you're not getting. So I'll give you an example
Yeah.
of I was talking to a person in the quarrying industry yesterday who was telling me that um, he had taken over a site for a short amount of time, and it was known to be, well, thought to be a really, really good site, but then, and it had no reports, no incidents coming in, any of that kind of stuff. And then when they started to actually look at the processes, they realised that there were just all these accepted practices, and it was just that near misses weren't getting reported, and
Yeah.
there was a whole heap of machine risk that was sitting there unmanaged. And I mean, executives need to know about that too. I would say, yeah, the stuff that's not coming through.
And so again, in part, I think the way you address that is through an objective process, as opposed to, as knowing, knowing that I should be asking about X. You flip it around, you identify what the critical concerns of the organisation are, and you regularly ask for that narrative, research, inquiry-based work. Tell me if that is being done well and being done properly. That's what you want to know about, I think.
Bingo, which is exactly what critical control programs should tell you. You can look at each of your individual risks and see what you're not getting information on.
And all I'd say to that, Jodi, and I don't disagree, and I think this is a refining conversation we have to keep having. I've spoken to plenty of people who have described the way their critical risk programs degenerate into tick and flick exercises. Yeah, we know that's a thing. I've already given you an example of business rules in one organisation that were completely inappropriate to the understanding of the risk. And so I think, for me, again, the safety literate question or the position is to understand that all of our processes can be are based on assumptions and can be subject to organisational corruption. So how do we go and test that in relation to our process? And if we're going to stick the word critical in front of a process, the court will take you at your word that it was critical. So if you stuck critical in front of something, you probably need to invest a bit more time and effort to understand it, if it's working properly.
I mean, what's really interesting about that is there's alignment then. Is it fair to say there's alignment between, if you stick critical before something and you're serious about it, then that is something you want real feedback to understand is actually working, and the workers understand that it's actually working, and everyone has an understanding of the importance of that control and the effectiveness of that control. That appears in very close alignment to me to what the court expects of you as well in an officer in an organization.
Yeah, certainly as an organisation, absolutely. I think it's consistent with decided authority around officers, and I think we will see that as the case law around officer due diligence under WHS starts to develop.
We could probably keep going for another 3 hours. Just very quickly, a minute or 2 minutes each. Final thoughts, Greg, from you, and then we go to Jodi.
I mean, my thoughts on this are reasonably well developed, and I'll just go back to where I started. We do a lot of stuff in safety. Most of what we do is subject to assumption and organisational corruption. We measure activity. We need to surface the assumptions that underpin our systems and recognise the potential corruption. And we need to stop counting how much we do and get far more invested in the efficacy of the processes.
Thanks, Greg. Jodi?
It seems like law is actually more aligned than we thought to having critical risk programs, which is really good. I just always come back to those three things. Do you know your fatal risks? Do you understand what your main controls are, and are they in place and effective? And that is the guts of exactly what we should be doing in all of our safety management. And that just should lead us to be asking questions like, why am I measuring LTIs and thinking that I'm understanding my fatality risk?
Thank you, Greg. Thank you, Jodi. Thank you, everyone, who joined us today. We could have gone on and on. I'd remind you, we kind of want to go on and on. So send us in your questions. You can send them in on a form on the website, just through a normal way of contacting Brady Heywood. We'd love to get your questions over the next month or so, and we'll have a look at them, and we'll hopefully come back in the new year to unpack some of the things that you all think is important that we've missed. But I absolutely agree with Greg. I think this is the beginning of the conversation, not the end. And for me, safety in mining or outside mining, it's all a system that sits inside a system, and law is part of that system. And unless we have these sort of conversations where we try and bridge the gap and deal with the apparent inconsistencies, we're never really going to make any progress. So thank you very much, Jodi. Thank you very much, Greg. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming along.
Thanks, Sean. Thanks, Jodi. Cheers.